everyone. Thank you so much for having us. I'm Tia Williams. I write love stories, romances, and we are here today to talk about writing love. And I am so excited to be here with Jose and Yue. And their books have set my world on fire as I was reading them over the past 2 weeks. And I'm just so excited to talk to them about their process, about their inspirations, their loves. Do I need to lean over this much? So why don't we just jump right in? So let's go with Jose first. Can you tell us all about your book?
Yeah, so my book is called Promises of Gold. You can see it here. Promises of Gold is a book of poems. I started writing poems when I was in high school, and this book really was inspired by visiting high school students and college students, and I had a love poem in my first book, and before I read it, I would be like, raise your hand if you're in love, and the audience of young people would be silent, you know what I mean? And so it led me to wonder if love was out of style with young people or if maybe there was a gap, you know what I mean? Like maybe they just, because I remember as a young person not always having the language to talk about love, right? And so I wanted to write a book of love poems for family, romantic love poems, of course, as well as love poems for my friends. So that's really what inspired this book of poems.
Yeah, and what really stuck with me is that your poems explored all different types of love, right? Familial love, romantic love, homie love. And you have a line, you say, no disrespect to romantic love, but what about our friends? Those homies who are there all along, cheering for us, reminding us that love is abundant. And I thought that was just such a novel approach because we don't talk that much about platonic love. But you do really also touch on romantic love. You have a poem called Love Poem Beginning in a Yellow Cab. Oh. And it takes riding in a yellow cab, which is something that we've all New Yorkers have done, and have turned it in. You turn it into a transcendent experience. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, because one of the themes I've noticed in your poetry is you sort of take the everyday or the mundane and you elevate it to this larger-than-life romantic status.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I feel a little bit like an amateur sitting with both of you because I feel like, I read and listen to romantic novels on audiobook, in part because I want to write fiction, and I feel like reading romantic novels is a really good way to learn about plot and pacing and things like that. So I really respect the craft. So it means a lot to me to hear that you thought that that was a transcendent poem. Absolutely. I mean, I grew up in Calumet City, Illinois, which is a south suburb of Chicago and is a very working class place. And when I started writing poems, I thought that I had to look away from where I was from in order to be inspired, right? Because a lot of the poetry that maybe we were taught in schools was about, Robert Frost in the forests of New England. And those places seem to be, to me, where inspiration lived, places that have this kind of innate sense of wealth or spirituality to them, whereas I was growing up among smokestacks and concrete. And so for me, kind of learning to write my own poetry was about learning to turn back towards my life and really pay close attention at the details and find those romantic moments in the places where I was living and where I was from.
Which you definitely do. I mean, Cheetos make an appearance, malls, fake gold necklaces, and everything sounds so elevated. These everyday things that we experience. Brilliant. You also talk about writing during COVID, which we probably all have experience with. How did lockdown affect your view of relationships and connections with other people?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I had this intention that I wanted to write this book of different types of love. And what I found was that the language kept turning towards fear and anxiety and worry. And I struggled for a moment to think about, do I edit out those concerns, those worries? And I think in the end, what I decided with this book was that it feels realer to me if instead of just trying to edit out and pretend that all love is perfect, that the love was a type of struggle, that there were moments of fluctuation, that the love was kind of representative of all of the different emotions that we feel, right? That in love, there's also hints of worry and hints of fear and hints of loneliness, maybe even. So I tried to include and kind of embrace those concerns during COVID, as opposed to just trying to pretend that it wasn't happening.
Right. And certainly not to put words in your mouth, but I know when I was at home, I was thinking a lot deeper about who the people in my life were and why they made the choices they made. You know, it's a lot of times sitting at home, it lost in your thoughts. And some of your pieces, especially the ones about your mother and your relationship with your mother, really spoke to me because so often in poetry, it's your perspective only. And in writing about her, it's clear that there's some edge there. There may be some tension there, but you explore why that might be from her side of things. You know, who would she be if I was never born? Who would she be if, you know, life hadn't dealt her what it had? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that in your writing process.
Yeah. So both of my parents immigrated to the United States from Mexico right before I was born. And my relationship with my mom has always, like, my mom kind of maintains the mask of parenthood. So there's, you know, when I ask her questions about, you know, who she was before she had kids or growing up in Mexico, she doesn't really want to talk about it. Like, she really sees herself as a mother, at least in her relationship with me and my siblings, kind of keeps that, likes that kind of role for herself. And so part of writing about my mom for me was about, and I didn't want to write about my mom only as a mom, right? Because I know that she has other facets to her life, and I didn't want to kind of make her a one-dimensional person in that way. So it was kind of about writing into the things that I didn't know, as like beginning with the moments that I could touch and kind of moving out from there. But that was something that I learned from a mentor of mine who, you know, read one of my early poems about my mom. This was like 10, 15 years ago, and was like, maybe you should consider that your mom wasn't always a mother, and you should really try and like imagine her in other ways. And from that moment on, I was just like, that makes total sense to me. I don't want to write about my mom just as like the person that labors on behalf of my family. I want to think about like what is animating her and try to really think about everything that she's been through and everything that she loves in life beyond just being a mom.
The person that labors on behalf of my family. If that is not a mom, if that is not a mom. Okay, so I would thank you for that. I would love to talk a little bit about Long Past Summer, if you would like to tell us all about your fabulous debut work.
I have a kind of loud voice, so I don't want to be too close to the mic. You guys can hear me? Yeah, I figured. Long Past Summer is a second chance romance. It's about a woman from Georgia who comes to New York, aspires to come to New York and does. But before she leaves, as a young woman, she falls in love with someone, but she chooses her aspirations and comes to New York, but chance, fate, whatever, brings him back into her orbit 20 years later, and they have a chance to rekindle their romance if they are both brave enough to do it.
And it's so delicious.
Oh, thank you.
So, like Jose, who also writes about friendship love, we'll get to the romance love in a second.
Sure.
But you do have a heavy dose of a friendship relationship in this that is
Fractured.
Fractured, almost as star-crossed as something that you would find in a romantic love. Can you talk a little bit about writing that piece?
I don't know. I think that is particularly when I was younger, particularly when I was living in basically white spaces. I found that my friendships were somewhat colored by power dynamics, kind of, and so that I wanted to kind of explore that a little bit in terms of, because she has a friendship with her sister, which is very it's not only just sisters but sister friends, and everybody kind of recognizes that kind of relationship, that kind of friendship. But then there's this other kind of friendship that people deny that they have, where there is somewhat of a differential about who is the person who kind of leads the way, and who is the person who kind of follows, and who's the person that is kind of making the decisions in the friendship. And it's not always healthy, but sometimes you don't realize that it's not healthy too, which is why I think it feels a little star-crossed, because they were truly friends, but there was all this other stuff working there that complicated it.
Yeah, and sometimes these platonic female relationships we have, in our tween and teen years, can hit harder than any romantic thing.
Yeah.
It can be so deep. What drew you to second chance romance? As someone who has written, a story that relies on flashback and a love back then and a love now, it's hard. It's complicated. So what made you want to write with that trope?
It's so funny because initially I actually didn't. The intent was actually to write, I was really writing a story of young love. And the meeting again older was really a framing device to reflect back on this young love. But when I gave my story to my critique partners, they were like, well, what are you writing here? Is this supposed to be YA, or is this supposed to be for an adult? So YA is youth fiction. So they were like, is this YA, or is this, and I mean, you can write young people and it still be for an adult, but I think they felt, because I think I was in writing, I was very much in my youthful space and my youthful point of view, and so I think they felt a little bit like it was I don't want to say juvenile, but they could feel that. And so, and I realized, I said, no, that's not actually what I'm writing. I'm trying to write this for adults. And so they were like, well, then I think it would behoove you to build out the adult portion of their romance, since that's where they are now. And that's the more complicated part of it. Like, how do you find each other again? And how do you reestablish a love? And how do you, if decide whether or not it's even worth revisiting? And in doing that, it became this dual timelines. It was a second chance, but it was not, originally wasn't, the focus wasn't the second chance. The focus was the initial love. And so as it grew, I realized, I was like, oh, and these beats, they kind of reflect one another. The beat from when their youth and the beat as an adult, they kind of reflect each other, because initially they were still relating to each other in the way that they related to each other as in their youth. So I realized that I wanted to explore that.
Yes. One of the themes that came up for me as I was reading was the way that we can sometimes self-sabotage our own happiness.
Yeah.
Which Michaela, who is a complicated lady,
Hope so.
definitely does that. What made you want to write about that? I feel like I don't read that a lot in romance.
Well,
it's always an outside force coming in
Yeah.
to ruin, everything. It's not always coming from the person.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if that's not a little bit of me in there. That's the part that's the self insert, is just the way in which I can sometimes like sabotage my own happiness by like in inspecting it too closely and like picking it apart so that it loses its like the heart of it, and it becomes these like separate parts. So she wants to be a successful person, and so to the exclusion of everything else, that becomes what all that she's like focused on, is not just her her work success, but just what the signs of success are. So I have this, I have this, I have this, and it starts to be like, well, other people, when they have these things, they also have their internal life, and that fills out their happiness. And she's so focused on these little the elements, the separate parts of happiness, that she doesn't realize that she's ending up ruining it for herself. She's not realizing that she's not seeing the bigger picture. She's just seeing the individual parts of it.
Yeah, which is so real. Okay, now I'm going to ask some questions for both of you to answer. I think the biggest question to ask a romance love panel is, why are you called to write these stories?
You gonna? I realized a long time ago, I didn't read romance, but I realized a long time ago that though the romantic elements of every story I read were the parts that called to me the most, regardless of what the actual genre was of the fiction that I was reading. It was always, the love relationship that really interested me. And do they get together? Or how do they get together? What happens? And so I realized, that's actually your interest. If you were going to write something, it's love that you're really interested in. All the rest of it is kind of like the scenario.
I'll take the next question first. I promise. For me, when I started writing poems, I started writing like love poems to crushes. That was how I got started. That's what drew me to it. Was like unrequited love. I think what keeps me writing about love is a few different things. One, I just really enjoy reading love poems. Like, those are still, to your point, those are still some of my favorite poems. When a love poem is executed well, it can kind of remind you, to use your word, of like the transcendence of that feeling. And so I love poems. I also find them incredibly challenging. Like, it's hard to write a really good love poem, in part because if you get too cheesy, it very quickly it loses its magic, right? And on the other hand, if you try to be too smart or like try to be too original with it, it can turn into like very opaque and unreadable. Like, it loses that feeling of love, that kind of joy that wells up inside of us. And so for me, part of what keeps me writing love poems is just how difficult it is to try to pull something together that keeps the magic of that emotion really vibrant in a poem.
It's so hard. It really is hard to strike that balance because things can get corny so fast.
So fast.
Yeah. So both of you have found ways to weave trauma into these stories, whether it's growing up with financial instability or being the child of a difficult divorce. Why was it important for you to show the darker sides of relationships?
All right, I said I would go first. I think, again, it's kind of what I was saying earlier, right? Like, in trying to write, I try to write and embrace everything about the world, not just the pretty things necessarily, but try to really think through all of the complications of what it means to be alive and in relationship with people. And I think it's true for romantic relationships as well as friendships, that things aren't always easy or they don't always feel good. And that doesn't mean that a relationship is failing. It just means that there's something to work through there. and then my second answer would be that it's kind of, I can't help it. You know what I mean? Like, I grew up in Calumet City. It's such a big part of like how I see the world is through the eyes of someone that grew up in poverty, that I can't help but like, even, I write about my experience going to Paris with my love, our first trip together to Paris, and that should be such a romantic and exuberant experience. And I couldn't help but like look at all of the luxury in Paris and be like, it's really fucked up that I grew up in Calumet City, like thousands of miles away, and had to like fight and claw and do all of this just to make this possible for a day. You know what I mean? Like, I can't help but be reminded of where I come from, even in those moments. And part of it might just be like needing more therapy myself, but I think that's part of why it filters into the writing.
I just felt kind of like that's life. Like you can't really enjoy. Well, I mean, it sounds kind of trite to say it that way, but you don't really enjoy love if you don't have those other elements, the darker things. Like the hero in my book, he suffered a lot of loss, so it kind of explains why he's able to bounce back so quickly from the loss of this woman that he thought was the love of his life, is because he's been losing his whole life. He's had to learn how to work through that and not let that just, kind of lay waste to him. So so I think that helped to inform the characters and inform their love style or love language, and then also because I think it just is more realistic.
Yeah. I don't remember who said it. I was on a panel once, and an author was saying that it helps to have a degree in psychology when you're writing in any genre, because it helps with understanding character. So we're all authors from underrepresented communities. I know that for me, it's been so hard. I've been in this game for quite some time. My first book we were talking about it earlier, in 2001, and times have changed, not that much, in terms of publishing, because it's such a monochromatic industry. And
I like that monochromatic.
Monochromatic. It's a diplomatic way of saying what we all know to be true. But I'm interested to hear your stories in sort of getting your stories heard in publishing, and what that journey has been like for both of you.
Yeah, please.
I started writing when I was a teenager, and at the time I didn't know that there was a real pathway to becoming a writer, and in particular becoming a poet. I didn't know that could be a career, in part because I didn't really know any poets who came from where I was from or who like lived near me. So I didn't have, like, when I was starting to write poems, all of the poems that I read were by people that were dead and buried, right? And so it was hard for me to think about that as something that was a possibility for me. For me, what it's been like trying to get published has been kind of a combination of a couple of things. One was that it was very hard for poetry publishers to accept poems about Mexican identity that weren't exclusively about the border or about crossing the border or about the moment of migration. For them, the whole concept of Mexican American identity was wrapped up in that one moment. And so when I was coming up, kind of reading poems and sharing poems about all of the ripples of migration and all of the different after effects of migration, it was hard for them to imagine how they could market it and actually find an audience for it. And so part of it was really just having to struggle and be like, no, I'm telling you, there is an audience for this. We're much bigger than that, just that one moment, right? Mm-hmm. And then the other moment was just kind of at one point, kind of giving up on that particular experience and just focusing on the people that were getting it. And so like before poetry publishers ever came knocking at my door, right? I was already putting together little zines with friends, and we were selling them at shows together, and we were like doing little shows at each other's houses, and we started to build an audience that way, so that by the time I was publishing books, I already had not a huge audience, but I had an audience of readers that really cared about the work that I was making.
And that, I'm just going to jump in for a second. You really landed on something there, because when you're saying the editors and the publishing houses when they thought of Mexican Americans, they're thinking of the border, they're thinking of that immigration journey, they're thinking of Texas, they're thinking, and that's part of the problem when everyone is white. They're focusing on the relationships that they have with an underrepresented community, and it might be what they hear on the news, or what someone at their church has been telling them, and it's not real life experience, and because of that, a lot of times they miss out on just the idea of our humanity, just being who we are, just existing in good stories, existing in good poetry. So that's why diversity is so important in publishing. Anyway. Sorry.
So I've written most of my life. When I got out of college, I worked very briefly for .com that I wrote articles and that sort of thing. And then when that ended, I kind of put the writing aside. It's so interesting because conversely, you were saying that, digital, going from print media to digital media, in the early aughts was very difficult. And when the kind of .com bubble kind of burst, it was hard to jump as a writer who had been doing digital media into print media. And so I just kind of was like, oh, well, that wasn't for you. And I put it aside. And then in the early 2010s, I fell into like a fandom and started writing for them. And that wrote fan fiction. And that kind of brought me back into writing. And so, yeah.
So this next question was actually for you and LaQuette about interracial romances. I still want to ask it, though. Okay. And Jose, please feel free to jump in. I loved your racially diverse cast of characters. Love so much. What made you decide for the male protagonist to be white?
I don't know. I wish I could.
Or maybe
say,
it wasn't a thought.
I wish I could say that it was like, I think it was because I was kind of modeling my romance on this fan fiction romance that I had been following, and so they were interracial, and so that was like the first place that my brain went. Plus, I think I like to talk about particularly Black women being loved by a full spectrum of people. I love Black love, don't get me wrong. My second book is a Black romance, but I think I just was like, well, there's a whole world, and particularly because in my book, this character grew up in a white town, so it's white people that she would meet, that, that's how it kind of came to be. I wish I had more of like a real mission statement behind it, but I didn't.
You don't need one. It's just coming. I'm just I'm always curious about those choices.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to add to this? Have you written an interracial romance poem?
I mean, my wife is a Black woman, so the love poems are interracial love poems, I suppose.
Okay.
But yeah.
That's it. That's all you gotta say. Okay. What is the easiest and the most challenging part about writing romantic love? Easiest first.
It's all hard. It's all hard. I think the easiest part, I suppose, is just finding the characters, like finding who they are, because for me at least, they kind of come to me fully formed, and so then it becomes like kind of the jigsaw puzzle of how do I put these two fully formed people into a love relationship with each other, which is the hard part.
Okay, fair. Yep.
I think for me, I don't know about easiest, but the best part is that in looking for inspiration for writing love poems, you get to really pay attention and start noticing some of the kind of underlying beauties and joys of being in relationship with someone. So for me, that close paying attention is probably the best part. And then the hardest part is, like I was saying earlier, like trying to walk the line between like being corny and romantic and not too corny that it becomes kind of, unreadable. So trying to like find that balance is probably the hardest part for me.
Okay. And what inspires your creativity? Is it music, TV, art, a person?
I think for me, I mean, I'm inspired by all sorts of things. I listen to music a lot. On my ride here, I was listening to Taylor Swift, so I'm thinking about,
Yes.
in particular, the song "The One" from Folklore. I'm like, what would that look like as a poem? So sometimes it's music, sometimes it's movies. I think I'm just inspired by art in general, maybe. Like I love going to museums and looking at some of the techniques and thinking about, like, for example, collage. How would collage work as literature? So all of those things are fascinating to me.
I would agree with Jose. I think it's a lot of things like TV, music, that sort of thing. Because sometimes I'll hear a song and it'll spark an idea. Sometimes I see people and I'm just like, what's going on there? And that'll give me like a little bit of inspiration. So yeah, I think it's just the world in general. I mean, that sounds really broad, and I don't mean it to be, but I just find inspiration all over the place, which, luckily, because sometimes I think I'm like, what is it? What's the next thing I'm going to write? And then it'll just kind of come to me from like a song or something.
When you least expect it.
Yeah.
So I've been told we have to wrap up. So just one more question. In case there are any writers in the audience, what is the best piece of writing advice you've ever gotten? Or maybe you have a fantastic bit of writing advice.
Best piece of writing advice that I've gotten. Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I think just keep it simple, because I tend to overwrite. So like, it's like, keep it simple. Don't get too, like Jose was saying, don't make it corny. Like,
Yeah.
keep it very simple. Keep it true, and it'll ring true.
I think the best advice that I was ever given was to read broadly. And so no matter what you want to write, you can gain different techniques, different crafts, and different ways of like looking and seeing and expressing by reading broadly and keeping yourself open to all of the possibilities. So yeah, for me, that would be the thing that I've held on to the most, is to always try and like read broadly and read a lot.
Same. Thank you both so much for this
Thank
conversation.
Thank you so much.
And I believe that we're going to be signing books.
Yes.
So follow us when we figure out where we're going.